As the sun dipped below the horizon, the remaining hues of twilight bled into the crevices of the devastated city, casting long shadows over the ruins. Mara, with the weight of her fire-axe resting on her shoulder, traversed the shattered glass and debris-strewn streets of what was once a thriving metropolis. The echo of her boots against the cracked concrete was the only sound piercing the heavy silence that had fallen like a shroud over the world. This city, a ghost of its former self, housed nothing but the whispers of the wind now, a reminder of the civilization that had perished in the cataclysm. Every building Mara passed bore the scars of the apocalypse, walls gashed open, towers bent like the backs of the elderly, and vehicles overturned and gutted. Nature had begun reclaiming the spaces humanity had abandoned, with vines creeping up the sides of buildings and wildflowers sprouting through the asphalt, defiant in their burst of color against the gray pallor of destruction. Mara had learned to navigate this new world with a survivor's acuity. Her eyes, sharp and scanning, missed nothing. She noted every movement, every slight rustle in the periphery, as she moved towards her destination, a high-rise apartment building on the edge of the downtown district that she hoped would yield supplies. Hunger gnawed at her, but it was the least of the threats she faced after dark. Nightfall was a curse. As the darkness deepened, so did the sense of foreboding. Tales of the horrors that emerged with the moon were common among the few survivors Mara had encountered. These weren't just stories to scare children. They were real warnings. Phantoms of the dead, creatures twisted by the fallout, and worse, shadows that moved of their own accord, as if puppeteered by some malevolent force lurking just out of sight. Mara approached the apartment building, her senses heightened. The structure loomed ominously against the night sky, its windows like hollow eyes watching her every move. She entered through a side door, its hinges complaining under her touch. Inside, the flashlight tied to her belt cut through the darkness, casting light on the remnants of lives hastily abandoned. Toys lay scattered on the floor of the lobby, left behind in a panic, a stark reminder of the suddenness of the disaster. With each floor she ascended, Mara's caution increased. She searched apartments methodically, kitchens for non-perishable food, bedrooms for clothes, bathrooms for medical supplies. In one apartment, a wall calendar was still turned to the month of the cataclysm, days marked with plans never realized. Mara's heart twinged with a rare hit of sorrow, quickly suppressed. Emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here. Not in the heart of darkness. As she reached the top floor, the air grew inexplicably cold. Her breath clouded in the beam of her flashlight, and the back of her neck prickled with the electric sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, axe ready, as a low growl echoed through the hallway. Shadows danced at the edge of her light, coalescing into forms too ghastly to be merely human. Mara steadied her breath, gripping her axe. This was the world now, a place of endless night where humanity was no longer the apex predator, and survival meant facing the unknown horrors that lurked in the ruins of their own creation. She was ready. This was her reality, her battleground. With the shadows moving in, Mara whispered a challenge to the dark, her voice a defiant blade slicing through the oppressive silence. The fight for dawn was about to begin, and she was not going to fade into the night without a struggle. The last light might have fallen, but Mara was a beacon of her own, burning fiercely against the encroaching dark. Mara's breath fogged in the icy air as she descended deeper into the underbelly of the city, the musty scent of decay and damp stone filling her nostrils. She treaded carefully, her eyes adapting to the dimness that the flashlight's beams struggled to pierce. She had entered the subway system, believing it might serve as a quicker route to the northern sectors where she had heard rumors of a survivor colony. However, this underground world, with its echoing tunnels and darkened corridors, was a labyrinth of both despair and danger. As she navigated the subway platforms, her flashlight flickered across the crumbling tiles, briefly illuminating graffiti that seemed fresher than the apocalypse itself. Words of warning, painted in hurried, jagged letters, screamed silently at her from the walls. "Beware the shadows that listen." Mara paused, her pulse quickening not from exertion, but from the creeping dread that these words brought. She had heard tales, yes, but to see such stark warnings here in the depths gave them a new weight. Something was watching, something was listening. She could feel its eyes upon her, its attention fixed as if she were a mouse in a maze. The further she delved, the more the atmosphere thickened with an almost tangible presence. The air was heavy, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Mara shook off the unease, focusing on the practical needs that had driven her into this haunting place. Supplies were critical, and the subway lines often had storerooms or lost and found areas that might still contain useful items. Mara's route took her past abandoned trains, their doors agape like the jaws of metal beasts long dead. Inside one such train she found a backpack, astonishingly well preserved and zipped tight. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing not only food and water but a handheld radio, a potentially invaluable find. She pressed the power button, and static filled the silence around her. Fumbling with the dial, Mara momentarily caught what sounded like a voice, a ghostly whisper of a broadcast, before it was swallowed up by static again. Encouraged yet unnerved, Mara pushed on. The passageways twisted and turned, leading her beneath the river that bisected the city. Here the walls sweated moisture, and the path became slippery, treacherous. It was in this narrow corridor that the shadows began to move with purpose, as if animated by a will of their own. Shapes flickered at the periphery of her vision, forms that were too deliberate to be mere tricks of the light. A chill swept through the tunnel, a cold that seeped into her bones, a cold that spoke of something ancient awakened by her trespass. Mara stopped, her breath visible in the flashlight's beam. She listened, the silence so deep it roared in her ears. Then a whisper, not in the air but inside her mind, a whisper that urged her to turn back, to flee the dark. She tightened her grip on the axe, her resolve hardening. Fear was a luxury, a weakness that could prove fatal, and she would not succumb. Turning a corner, she found herself in what appeared to be an old maintenance room. Tools, rusted and forgotten, lay scattered about. It was here, among these remnants of a world long gone, that the shadows converged, forming a dark, dense mass in the corner of the room. The air around it seemed to shimmer with a dark energy, and Mara could see now that these were not mere shadows cast by inanimate objects. They were something else, something sentient. Drawing a slow, steady breath, she approached, her every sense alert. As she drew closer, the mass stirred, and a low, menacing growl resonated through the room. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, expanding and contracting as if breathing. Mara raised her axe, ready to strike, ready to defend herself against whatever might emerge from this dark confluence. But then, as sudden as a blink, the shadows dissipated, retreating into the cracks and crevices of the room, leaving behind a palpable silence and a cold that lingered like a bad memory. Mara stood alone, her heart pounding, the only sound her heavy breaths cutting through the cold air. The shadows had withdrawn, but Mara knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Whatever dwelt in the dark had marked her, had gauged her measure. She gathered the supplies, slinging the backpack over her shoulder, and prepared to continue her journey. Each step now carried a new weight, a heavy burden of knowing that the eyes of the dark were upon her, watching, waiting. She was a warrior in a world of ruins, and she would meet whatever came with the steel of her resolve and the edge of her axe. Mara's journey north continued under the sombre twilight that never seemed to end, the perpetual dusk that had settled over the world serving as a grim reminder of the cataclysm's permanent scar on the earth. Her path was lit only by the dim glow of her flashlight and the occasional flicker of lightning that illuminated the sky with ghostly flashes. The city's towering ruins rose like spectres against the murky backdrop, their hollowed windows peering down like empty eye sockets of a long-dead colossus. Navigating the debris-choked streets, Mora's senses remained on high alert, the incident in the subway's depths having sharpened her instincts even further. Every rustle of wind through the twisted metal, every distant collapse of unstable masonry seemed a potential threat. The backpack she carried was a small treasure trove of survival gear, the radio crackling intermittently with snippets of voices, lost broadcasts from nowhere. Despite the static, the faint human sounds were a solace in the vast emptiness, a hint that she was not entirely alone in this desolate world. As the evening bled into night, a dense fog began to roll in from the river, creeping through the broken byways and engulfing the city in a thick white shroud. Visibility dwindled to a few feet, and Mora found herself enveloped in a damp mist that muffled sounds and distorted shapes. Her flashlight beam became a weak orb in the pervasive grey, catching only the swirling vapor ahead. It was within this spectral haze that Mora sensed rather than saw the shifting of shadows, the subtle movement that hinted at the presence of the creatures that stalked the fringes of the fog. She tightened her grip on her axe, her other hand reaching for a flint striker. A fire, she knew, might ward off some of the lesser dark dwellers, but it could also attract greater threats. Yet the need to see, to confirm her fears or dispel them, outweighed the risk. Striking the flint, Mora ignited a small fire in a cleared space amid the rubble. The flames took hold of some old wood and began to crackle, throwing a small circle of light around her. The fog retreated slightly with the warmth, but the circle of safety was pitifully small in the vast urban wilderness. As she warmed her hands, the silhouette of a creature loomed at the edge of the light. Large, its movements deliberate, it watched her from the darkness, its eyes reflecting the firelight like twin beacons. Mora stood slowly, her body tense, ready to fight or flee. But the creature did not advance. It simply observed, its breath visible in the cold air, a misty rhythm that matched her own. "Who are you?" Mora's voice broke the silence, her tone steady despite the pounding of her heart. The creature made no sound, but in the flickering firelight, it shifted, its form blurring at the edges, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Mora had heard of such beings, creatures transformed by the cataclysm into living nightmares, yet she held her ground, unwilling to show fear. For what seemed like hours, but could only have been minutes, the creature and Mora regarded each other across the fire. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature receded into the fog, disappearing without a trace except for the lingering chill in the air and the faint smell of ozone, a storm's harbinger. Mora sat back down, her eyes scanning the dense fog. She knew the encounter was not an isolated one. The city was alive in its way, populated by beings both spectral and real, some twisted by the new world, others perhaps remnants of something older, something that had existed before humanity's dominion. The rest of the night passed uneasily. Mora kept the fire alive, feeding it scraps of wood and debris, her eyes always on the swirling mist. By the time dawn approached, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the ruins in the pale light of morning. The city stood silent once more. The night's phantoms retreated into whatever corners and shadows served as their refuge in the daylight. Packing up her camp, Mora checked the radio one last time. Amidst the crackle of static, a clear voice suddenly cut through. "If anyone is out there, you're not alone." The transmission was brief, the signal lost almost as soon as it had come, but it was enough. Enough to fortify her resolve, to remind her of the reason she had set out from her safe haven in the first place. There were others out there, other survivors who might be looking for her as much as she was looking for them. With a renewed sense of purpose, Mora shouldered her backpack and set out once more, the city's ruins stretching out before her like the bones of a giant, long fallen but not forgotten. The day held no promises, but it held possibilities, and for Mora, possibilities were all she needed. Mora's journey had led her to the city's heart, where the skyscrapers stood like jagged teeth against the sky, remnants of man's ambition now just hollowed husks. This part of the city, once the vibrant center of commerce and life, was now the core of desolation and rumored hauntings. Local lore, passed down among the few survivors Mara had encountered in her travels, spoke of a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the echoes of the past played continuously like a loop of old film reels. As she moved deeper into the downtown area, the evidence of the cataclysm became more pronounced. Here the streets were littered not just with the debris of collapsed buildings, but with the remnants of abandoned hopes. Photographs, bleached by sun and rain, fluttered in the wind, snippets of smiles and laughter caught in a time before the end. Toys, books, and clothes were strewn about, as if dropped in a sudden flight. The scene was a macabre tableau, and Mara felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her from the shadows. Her goal was the old city hall, a towering structure rumored to house a library of old records and maps, information that could be crucial in her quest to find other survivors and perhaps a safe haven. But as she approached the grand building, its facade marred by scorch marks and shattered windows, she felt a chill deeper than the autumn air. The ground was covered in a fine layer of ash, and the air had a tang of burnt metal, suggesting recent fires had been set, possibly by looters or perhaps by those wanting to ward off the darker things said to inhabit the building. Mara entered the city hall with her axe ready, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, the grand lobby was a mess of overturned furniture and shattered marble. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it fresh, warning of curses and ghosts, and other, older layers speaking to protests and rallies held in the city's last days. It was a palimpsest of the city's final years, each layer a desperate message from the past. Moving carefully, Mara made her way toward the central library. The door was ajar, and she pushed it open slowly, wincing as it creaked loudly in the silence. The room beyond was vast, rows of books still standing on shelves, their spines covered in dust. Here and there, piles of books lay scattered where shelves had fallen or been knocked over. The place was eerie, silent except for the distant drip of water. As she searched through the records, the hairs on the back of Mara's neck stood on end. She had the distinct feeling of being watched. Turning quickly, flashlight sweeping the dark corners, she caught a glimpse of something moving, a shadow, quick and fluid, darting between the stacks of books. Holding her breath, she approached, axe at the ready. But instead of a ghost or creature, she found a child, a boy barely 10 years old, hiding behind a fallen bookshelf. His eyes were wide with fear, and he trembled as Mara knelt down, putting her weapon aside to show she meant no harm. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy, named Jax, was wary at first, but hunger and loneliness soon overcame his fear. He told Mara that he had been living in the city hall with his mother until a few days ago, when she went out to find food and never returned. He had been hiding from the shadow people he claimed roamed the halls at night. Creatures, he said, were drawn to the building's old records and the secrets they held. Reluctant to leave the boy alone, Mara decided to take him with her. She gathered up maps and some historical records that might help in her search for other survivors. As they left the library, Mara looked back at the shadowed stacks, a shiver running down her spine. Jax was right. There was something about this place that felt alive, as if the building itself was watching them depart. Together, they made their way back through the desolate city streets, the bond of their shared encounter at the heart of the haunt forming a fragile thread of trust. Mara knew the road ahead would be dangerous, filled with both real and spectral threats, but now she had someone else to fight for, and that made all the difference. The city might be a ruin, but for Mara and Jax, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in their struggle for survival in the world left in ruins. As Mara and Jax ventured deeper into the urban wilderness, the cityscape transformed around them. What had once been residential neighborhoods were now overrun with thick, creeping vines and the eerie, watchful quiet of abandoned homes. The streets they traveled were cracked and uneven, nature reclaiming the land with an aggressive persistence that Mara found both beautiful and melancholic. Mara taught Jax how to navigate through the ruins, showing him how to read the signs of the wild that had crept back into the city. which plants were edible, how to listen for the rustling of small animals, and how to detect the presence of larger, more dangerous creatures that might be lurking nearby. Jax proved to be a quick and eager learner, his youth not yet worn down by the harshness of their reality. His presence also shifted something in Mara, a softening, a crack in her stoic exterior that she hadn't realized was forming. Their journey was punctuated by moments of both tension and teaching. Every shadow could be a threat, but also a teaching moment to demonstrate stealth and caution. One afternoon, as they skirted around what looked like an old playground, Mara froze. Ahead, in the shadows of a twisted slide, a figure moved, large and imposing. Her hand instinctively went to her axe, her body tensing for a confrontation. But as they watched, the figure resolved into a man, stepping out into the dim light. He was alone, dressed in remnants of what might have been a police uniform. His face was weary, his eyes sharp and assessing as they landed on Mara and then Jax. Mara's grip on her weapon did not wane. Her experiences had taught her to be wary of both the living and the dead. The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," he called out, his voice rough with disuse. "I saw you with the boy. I've been alone for too long. Didn't expect to find others alive." Introductions were cautious but civil. The man, named Tom, shared his story. He had been part of a group of survivors who tried to establish a safe zone in the northern part of the city, but disagreements and disease had whittled their numbers down until he found himself alone. Hearing of Mara's intention to find a safe haven, he asked to join them. With Tom's addition, their small group found new strength and a renewed sense of hope. Tom knew parts of the city Mara had never ventured into, areas that might still hold supplies or clues to other survivor settlements. Their days took on a new rhythm, one of searching and scavenging, but also of shared stories and small laughter. Yet, as they moved through the city, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The shadows seemed to be converging on their path more frequently, as if drawn by their presence. Tom, skeptical at first, soon had to admit that there was something unnatural about how the darkness behaved around them. It was as if the city itself was responding to their quest, the ruins not merely inert stones and steel, but something more sentient. One evening, as they set up camp in an abandoned apartment building, Mara decided to use the radio again, hoping to catch more signals now that they were deeper into the city. As she adjusted the frequencies, a clear voice suddenly burst through the static, urgent and young. "To anyone who can hear this, we are a group of survivors located at the old museum on 5th. We are under attack, surrounded by—" The message cut off in a burst of static. The decision was immediate. Mara looked at Tom and Jax, seeing her own determination mirrored in their eyes. They would attempt a rescue. Packing up their minimal gear, they set out under the cover of night, guided by the flickering streetlights that still glowed sporadically along their path. The museum was several hours away, but urgency lent speed to their steps. As they moved, the convergence of shadows grew more aggressive, the darkness almost palpable as if trying to swallow the light of their torches. Mara felt a rising dread, the sensation of being drawn into a web that had been centuries in the weaving. But there was no turning back. As they neared the museum, the sounds of conflict reached them. Shouts, the clash of metal, the eerie, otherworldly screams of the assailants. Mara tightened her grip on her axe, ready to face whatever awaited them in the heart of the convergence. Their journey had led them here, to this moment of truth, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The museum loomed ominously as Mara, Tom, and Jax approached, its grand facade marred by the scars of conflict and the passage of time. The sounds of battle grew louder as they drew near, the air charged with a palpable tension that made the hairs on Mara's neck stand. The darkness seemed to clutch more tightly with each step they took, as if the night itself was alive and malevolent. Upon entering the museum, they were met with chaos. The remnants of a barricade lay shattered near the entrance, and signs of a struggle were evident in the overturned exhibits and splintered display cases. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the sharp tang of blood. In the dim light cast by their flashlights, they saw a small group of survivors cornered by what could only be described as shadows come to life, their forms shifting and twisting in impossible ways. Mara didn't hesitate. She charged forward with a roar, her axe swinging with deadly precision. Tom followed, drawing a pistol he'd managed to keep loaded and functional. Jax, though the youngest, was not idle. He darted around, finding a heavy piece of metal to wield, his eyes wide but his resolve firm. The shadows recoiled at the light and the sudden ferocity of the attack. These creatures, Mara realized, were manifestations of the city's haunted past, brought into being by the despair and death that had soaked into the very stones of the metropolis. Fighting them felt like battling a tangible nightmare, each blow forcing the dark to retreat, only for it to regather and surge forward again. As the battle raged, more survivors emerged from their hiding spots within the museum, bolstered by the arrival of Mara and her companions. Together, they pushed the shadowy assailants back, slowly turning the tide. Amidst the chaos, Mara caught glimpses of the museum's exhibits, historical relics and artworks that had survived the end of the world. In this moment, they served as stark reminders of all that had been lost and what still might be preserved. After what seemed like an eternity, the last of the shadows dissolved into the ether, leaving behind only the weary but alive group of survivors. The museum's main hall, now lit by the first light of dawn filtering through the shattered skylights, looked like a battlefield from another age. Mara, Tom, and Jax were met with gratitude and relief. The museum's survivors, a diverse group consisting of families, lone wanderers, and remnants of civic defenders, shared their stories. They spoke of how the shadows had begun to gather with increasing intensity, drawn to the museum for reasons none could understand. It was only through their collective efforts that they had held out for as long as they had. As the group recuperated, Mara explored the museum further. In a quiet, dusty corner, she found an old archive room with maps and documents detailing the city's history and mythologies. Among the papers, she discovered references to an ancient curse believed to have been set upon the city long before the apocalypse, a curse that spoke of darkness consuming the light. It was a chilling echo of the present circumstances, suggesting that the cataclysm might have been only a catalyst for deeper, darker forces at work. With a new understanding of what they were facing, Mara proposed a plan. They would fortify the museum, turning it into a sanctuary not just from the physical dangers of the post-apocalyptic world, but from the supernatural threats that seemed drawn to the city's heart. She spoke of forming a new community, one that could stand against the darkness with the light of human resilience and unity. The survivors agreed, motivated by Mara's vision and the immediate need for safety. Over the following days, they worked together to secure the museum, reinforce its defenses, and establish a semblance of order. Mara, Tom, and Jax found their roles in this nascent society, their bonds strengthened by the trials they had faced. As the first week of their new life dawned, Mara stood before the museum, watching the sun rise over the city. The light spread over the broken streets, casting long shadows that retreated with the advancing day. The darkness would return, she knew, but they would be ready. They had found something worth fighting for, each other and a future where the dawn was not just a hope, but a promise.